The desert wind carried whispers of ancient secrets across the barren landscape of Arizona Territory, where the year 1882 had brought nothing but bloodshed between the white settlers and the Apache tribes. In this unforgiving land, where survival meant choosing between honor and pragmatism, two souls were about to collide in a way that would challenge everything they believed about their worlds. The story begins with Jake Morrison, a weathered cowboy whose past was as scarred as the leather chaps he wore, riding through Apache territory with a burden that weighed heavier than the gold in his saddlebags. What he didn't know was that his destiny was about to intertwine with that of Ayanna, a fierce Apache woman whose own quest for justice would lead them both down a path neither could have imagined. If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us as we bring these stories to life. Jake Morrison had been riding for 3 days straight, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of red dust that seemed to follow him like the ghosts of his past. The sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered face, deepening the lines that spoke of too many years spent under the harsh western sky. His blue eyes, once bright with the optimism of youth, now held the weary knowledge of a man who had seen too much death and carried too many regrets. The Colt, 45 at his hip, felt heavier with each mile, not because of its weight, but because of the lives it had taken in service of causes he no longer believed in. 3 months earlier, Jake had been just another gun for hire, working for the railroad company that was pushing its iron rails deeper into Apache territory. The money was good, and the work seemed straightforward enough. Protect the workers, keep the Indians at bay, and help civilization march westward. But everything changed the night he witnessed Colonel Harrison's men massacre a peaceful Apache camp, slaughtering women and children in their sleep. The image of small bodies lying motionless in the moonlight had burned itself into his memory, and no amount of whiskey could wash it away. Now he rode with stolen gold, money meant to fund more such atrocities, hoping to find some way to make amends for the blood on his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was riding through the very territory where the people he had wronged still lived, still fought, still died for their right to exist. Every shadow could hide an Apache warrior. Every rock formation could conceal an ambush. Yet Jake pressed on, driven by a desperate need for redemption that he wasn't even sure was possible. The landscape around him told its own story of conflict. Burned-out homesteads dotted the horizon, their blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Unmarked graves, some fresh, some old, served as grim reminders that this was a land where mercy was a luxury few could afford. The Apache had been fighting for their survival for decades, pushed from their ancestral lands by an endless tide of settlers, soldiers, and fortune seekers. Each attack, each retaliation, each act of violence only deepened the chasm between two peoples who seemed destined to destroy each other. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jake's horse suddenly tensed, its ears pricking forward with alert attention. Years of frontier life had taught him to trust his mount's instincts, and he immediately reined in, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. The silence that followed was deafening. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, just the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. It was the kind of silence that preceded either death or revelation, and Jake had learned to fear both equally. That's when he saw her. Ayanna emerged from behind a cluster of red rocks like a vision born from the desert itself. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this harsh land, her long black hair flowing behind her like a dark river. Her buckskin dress, adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the light, spoke of a proud heritage that refused to be broken by the encroaching white world. But it was her eyes that stopped Jake cold, dark, intelligent, and filled with a pain that mirrored his own. She held a rifle with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to use it, and the way she positioned herself told Jake that she had been watching him long before he had noticed her. This was no chance encounter. She had chosen this moment, this place, for reasons he could only guess at. The setting sun painted the sky behind her in shades of red and gold, making her appear almost ethereal, like one of the spirits his Apache contacts had spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. "You ride through our land with the stench of betrayal on you, white man," she said, her English clear and precise, though accented with the musical cadence of her native tongue. "The wind carries stories of what you have done, and the earth cries out for justice." Jake slowly raised his hands, showing that he meant no immediate threat, though he knew that in this situation, intentions mattered less than actions. "I reckon you got every right to feel that way, ma'am," he replied, his voice hoarse from days of silence. "I ain't here to cause more trouble. Matter of fact, I'm hoping to prevent some." Ayanna's laugh was bitter, like the taste of alkali water. "Prevent trouble? You who rode with the bluecoats? You who stood by while children were murdered in their sleep?" Her grip on the rifle tightened, and Jake could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. "My brother was in that camp, Cowboy. My brother and his wife and their 2 little ones. They died because men like you decided that Apache blood was worth less than railroad gold." The words hit Jake like physical blows, each one finding its mark in the tender places where his guilt lived. He had suspected that his past would catch up with him eventually, but he hadn't expected it to wear such a beautiful, terrible face. "I know," he said, quietly, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "I know, and I ain't got words for how sorry I am, but I'm trying to make it right." "Make it right?" Ayanna's voice rose, carrying across the empty landscape like a war cry. "Can you bring back the dead? Can you give children back their mothers, wives back their husbands? Can you undo the tears that have been shed, the prayers that have gone unanswered?" Jake felt the weight of the gold in his saddlebags, suddenly understanding how inadequate his gesture would seem to someone who had lost everything. "No, ma'am, I can't do none of that. But I got something that might help your people survive what's coming. Money that was meant to fund more killing, more raids. I want to give it to your chief. Let him use it to buy supplies, weapons, whatever your people need." For a long moment, Ayanna studied him with those penetrating dark eyes, as if she could see straight through to his soul and weigh the truth of his words. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of history, the burden of loss, and the faint, fragile possibility of something that might, in time, become forgiveness. "You think gold can wash the blood from your hands?" she asked finally. But there was something different in her voice now, a note of curiosity that hadn't been there before. "No," Jake replied honestly. "But maybe it can keep more blood from being spilled. Maybe it can give your people a fighting chance." The sun continued its relentless descent, painting the desert in deeper shades of red and purple. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying the loneliness of the vast wilderness. Jake's horse shifted restlessly, sensing the tension in the air, while Ayana remained as still as the ancient rocks around them, a living statue carved from determination and grief. "My name is Ayana," she said at last, lowering her rifle slightly. "It means eternal blossom in my language, though there has been little blooming in my life these past months." "Jake Morrison," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "And I reckon I understand about the lack of blooming. Seems like this whole territory's been caught in a winter that won't end." Ayana's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment, Jake caught a glimpse of the woman she might have been in a different world, a different time. "You speak of winter, but do you know what it means to watch your world die piece by piece? To see the sacred places of your ancestors turned into cattle ranches and mining claims? To know that your children will grow up strangers in the land that birthed their people?" The pain in her voice was so raw, so immediate, that Jake felt it like a knife to his chest. He had thought he understood the scope of what was happening in the territory, but hearing it from someone who lived it, breathed it, bled it every day, made him realize how little he truly comprehended. "I'm beginning to," he said quietly, "and I'm beginning to understand why you might want me dead." Ayana raised the rifle again, but this time, Jake sensed it was more from habit than genuine intent. "Death would be too easy for you, Jake Morrison. Death would end your suffering, and I think you need to live with what you've done. The question is, what will you do with that life?" As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake realized that this conversation was far from over. The Apache woman before him held not just his immediate fate in her hands, but possibly the key to the redemption he so desperately sought. The desert night was falling, and with it came the promise of revelations that would change both their lives forever. The night air carried a chill that seemed to seep into Jake's bones as he and Ayana faced each other in the growing darkness. The desert, which had been mercilessly hot during the day, now embraced them with a cold that spoke of the vast emptiness surrounding them. Stars emerged one by one in the clear sky, their ancient light bearing witness to a conversation that would determine whether this encounter ended in bloodshed or something far more complex. "You want to help my people," Ayana said, her voice carrying a skepticism earned through years of broken promises and betrayed trusts. "But help from a white man always comes with a price. What do you want in return for this gold you speak of?" Jake considered her question carefully, knowing that his answer would likely determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. "Nothing," he said finally. "Nothing, except maybe the chance to sleep without seeing dead children in my dreams." Ayana's eyes narrowed, studying his face in the starlight. "You think giving away stolen money will cleanse your soul? You think my people's forgiveness can be bought?" "No," Jake replied, his voice heavy with the weight of his guilt. "I don't think anything can cleanse what I've done. But maybe, just maybe, it can prevent more of the same from happening. Your people are fighting a war they can't win, with bows and arrows against rifles and cannons. This gold could buy them weapons, supplies, maybe even safe passage to Mexico for the women and children." The mention of Mexico seemed to strike a chord with Ayana, and Jake saw something flicker in her expression. Hope, perhaps, or the memory of hope. "You know of the troubles in Mexico?" she asked. I know that some Apache bands have found refuge there, away from the U.S. Army's reach, Jake said. I know that Geronimo himself has crossed the border more than once when things got too hot up here. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could almost see the wheels turning in her mind as she weighed his words against her own knowledge and experience. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her decision. My father was a war chief, she said finally, her voice taking on a different quality, as if she were speaking not just to Jake, but to the spirits of her ancestors. He fought the Mexicans, then the Americans, always believing that if we just fought hard enough, long enough, we could keep our lands. He died believing that, with a cavalry saber in his chest and his war paint still fresh on his face. Jake felt the profound sadness in her words, the weight of a people's struggle condensed into one man's death. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Sorry, Ayanna repeated, as if testing the word. Such a small word for such a large thing. But perhaps... She paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal conflict. Perhaps there is something you can do beyond giving us your stolen gold. Name it, Jake said without hesitation. Ayanna's smile was sharp as a blade. You know the white man's ways, his plans, his weaknesses. You have ridden with his soldiers, worked for his railroad. If you truly wish to help my people, then help us fight smarter, not just harder. The proposition hung in the air between them, like smoke from a campfire, visible but intangible, carrying with it the potential for either salvation or damnation. Jake realized that she was asking him to become something he had never been before, a traitor to his own race, the bridge between two worlds that seemed destined to destroy each other. You're asking me to spy on my own people, he said, not accusingly, but as a statement of fact. I am asking you to choose which people are truly yours, Ayanna replied. The ones who pay you to kill children, or the ones whose children you help to kill. The distinction was brutal in its clarity, and Jake felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a long locked door. For months, he had been drifting, carrying his guilt like a millstone around his neck. But now he was being offered something he hadn't dared to hope for, a chance to actively work against the forces that had made him complicit in atrocity. What would you need to know? He asked. Ayanna's expression changed, and for the first time since their encounter began, Jake saw something that might have been approval in her eyes. Everything. Troop movements, supply lines, planned raids, the railroad schedule, the locations of new settlements, the Army's strategies for dealing with Apache resistance. That kind of information could get a lot of people killed, Jake said, though he wasn't sure if he was referring to soldiers or Apache warriors. People are already dying, Ayanna replied, with stark honesty. The only question is whether they die for something or for nothing. As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of gunfire echoed across the desert, coming from the direction of the nearest settlement. Both Jake and Ayanna tensed, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. But the shots were too far away to pose an immediate threat. Still, they served as a grim reminder of the violence that plagued this land, the endless cycle of attack and retaliation that had turned the Arizona territory into a charnel house. Another raid, Ayanna said quietly, her voice filled with a weariness that seemed far older than her years. More widows, more orphans, more reasons for hatred. Jake found himself thinking of the families in that distant settlement, people who had come west seeking a better life and instead found themselves caught in a war they barely understood. But he also thought of the Apache families who had been destroyed by similar raids, The children who would never grow up. The mothers who would never hold their babies again. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I help you, there's no going back. I'll be a wanted man among my own people." "You are already a wanted man," Ayanna pointed out. "Wanted by your own conscience, if nothing else." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. He had been running from himself as much as from any external threat, carrying the weight of his actions like a cancer that was slowly eating him alive from the inside. "There's something else," Ayanna continued, her voice taking on a different tone. "Something you should know before you make your decision." Jake waited, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him would be significant. "The gold you carry, it's not just meant for more raids. Colonel Harrison plans to use it to fund a final campaign, one designed to wipe out every Apache band in the territory. He calls it his final solution to the Indian problem." The words hit Jake like a thunderbolt, and suddenly the weight of the gold in his saddlebags felt crushing. He had known it was meant for violence, but the scope of Harrison's plan was beyond anything he had imagined. "How do you know this?" he asked. Ayanna's smile was grim. "Because I was there when he discussed it with his officers. Hidden in the shadows, listening to white men plan the extinction of my people." Jake stared at her in amazement, realizing that this woman was far more than she appeared. "You're a spy yourself." "I am a survivor," she corrected, "and survival sometimes requires knowing your enemy better than he knows himself." The revelation changed everything. This wasn't just a chance encounter between a guilty cowboy and a grieving Apache woman. This was a meeting between two people who had both chosen to walk in the shadows, to fight their battles with information as much as with weapons. "If Harrison's planning something that big, he'll need more than just this gold," Jake said, his mind racing through the implications. "He'll need supplies, reinforcements, detailed intelligence about Apache strongholds. All of which you could help us learn about," Ayanna said. "All of which could help us prepare, or better yet, prevent." The gunfire in the distance had stopped, leaving behind a silence that seemed ominous rather than peaceful. Jake found himself wondering who had died in those brief moments of violence, whose world had just been shattered by the brutal realities of frontier life. "You'll regret it," Ayanna said suddenly, her voice soft but carrying an undertone of warning. Jake looked at her, seeing in her face the accumulated wisdom of a people who had learned to expect betrayal from those who promised help. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll regret doing nothing even more." As the night deepened around them, Jake Morrison made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. In choosing to help Ayanna and her people, he was choosing to become something he had never been before. A man who fought for justice rather than money, for redemption rather than survival. "Only if you leave before dawn," he whispered, the words carrying a promise that went far beyond their immediate meaning. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. In the distance, a coyote howled again, its voice now seeming less lonely and more like a call to action. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama playing out below. But somehow their light seemed to bless the unlikely alliance that was forming in the Arizona wilderness. As Jake and Ayanna began to plan their next moves, neither of them could have imagined the trials that lay ahead, the dangers they would face, or the profound ways in which their partnership would challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, justice, and the possibility of redemption in a world gone mad with violence. The dawn came slowly to the Arizona desert, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost too beautiful for a land so steeped in blood and sorrow. Jake had spent the night in an uneasy sleep, his dreams filled with images of burning villages and the faces of the dead, while Ayanna had remained alert, her senses attuned to every sound and movement in the darkness around them. The temporary truce between them had held through the night, but both knew that the real test of their unlikely alliance was yet to come. As the first rays of sunlight crested the distant mountains, Ayanna rose from her position near the rocks where she had kept watch. Her movements were fluid and silent, like those of a predator who had learned that survival often depended on the ability to move without being detected. Jake watched her with a mixture of admiration and wariness, still not entirely certain whether she viewed him as an ally or simply as a useful tool in her people's struggle for survival. "The settlement that was attacked last night," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of grim knowledge. "It was Willow Creek. 12 families, mostly farmers and their children." Jake felt his stomach clench at the news. He had passed through Willow Creek several times during his work for the railroad, and he could picture the small cluster of adobe houses and the modest church that served as the community's heart. "How many?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "7 dead, including 2 children," Ayanna replied, her voice carefully neutral. "The rest fled into the desert. Some may survive long enough to reach Fort Apache." The numbers hit Jake like physical blows, each casualty a reminder of the endless cycle of violence that had consumed the territory. He found himself wondering if any of the dead were people he had known, families he had shared meals with during his travels. "Was it your people who did it?" he asked, trying to keep any accusation out of his voice. Ayanna's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or pain. "Does it matter? When white soldiers kill Apache children, do you ask which unit was responsible? Or do you simply add their deaths to the great ledger of injustice that this land has become?" Her words stung because they carried the weight of truth. Jake realized that he had been thinking in terms of individual responsibility when the real issue was the systematic violence that had made such tragedies inevitable. The attack on Willow Creek was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of retaliation and counter-retaliation that had been going on for decades. "You're right," he said quietly. "It doesn't matter who pulled the triggers. What matters is stopping it from happening again." Ayanna studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine or simply what he thought she wanted to hear. "Pretty words, Jake Morrison. But words are like water in the desert. They disappear quickly when the sun gets hot." "Then let me prove it with actions," Jake replied, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even him. "Tell me what you need me to do." For the first time since their encounter began, Ayanna smiled, and Jake was struck by how the expression transformed her face, revealing glimpses of the woman she might have been in a world without war. "First, we need to get that gold to my people, but not in the way you might expect." She moved to her horse, a magnificent paint stallion that had been hidden among the rocks, and began to prepare for travel. Jake watched her efficient movements, noting the way she checked her weapons and supplies with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to be ready for anything. "What do you mean?" he asked. "If you simply ride into an Apache camp with a bag of gold, You'll be dead before you can explain yourself, Ayanyana said matter-of-factly. My people have learned to be suspicious of gifts from white men, especially ones that come with no strings attached. Jake hadn't considered this possibility, but it made perfect sense. After decades of broken treaties and false promises, the Apache would naturally be wary of any offer of help from someone who looked like their oppressors. So what do you suggest? Ayanyana swung herself onto her horse, with a grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. We take the gold to my uncle, Cochise' son Naiche, but we do it carefully, and we do it together. Your presence with me will vouch for your intentions, at least enough to keep you alive long enough to explain yourself. The mention of Naiche sent a chill down Jake's spine. The son of the legendary Apache chief Cochise was known throughout the territory as a formidable warrior and leader, someone who had inherited his father's tactical brilliance, along with his implacable hatred of the white invaders. Meeting such a man would be dangerous under the best of circumstances, and Jake was far from certain that these qualified as the best of circumstances. "And after we deliver the gold?" he asked. "After that, we begin the real work," Ayana replied. "You return to your world, but now you'll be working for mine. Every piece of information you gather, every plan you learn about, every weakness you discover, all of it comes to us." Jake mounted his own horse, feeling the weight of the decision he was making settle over him like a heavy cloak. He was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed, to become a traitor to his own race in service of what he hoped was a higher justice. As they began to ride deeper into Apache territory, the landscape around them seemed to change, becoming wilder and more forbidding with each mile. The familiar landmarks of the white settlements gave way to ancient rock formations and hidden canyons that had sheltered Apache warriors for generations. This was a land that had never truly been conquered, despite the best efforts of the U.S. Army, and Jake could feel its power and mystery seeping into his bones. "Tell me about your uncle," he said as they navigated a narrow trail between towering red cliffs. Ayana was quiet for so long that Jake began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a reverence that spoke of deep family bonds and cultural pride. "Naiche is the last of the great war chiefs," she said. "When my father died, Naiche took me in, raised me as his own daughter. He taught me to read the white man's language, to understand his ways, because he knew that knowledge would be a weapon in the wars to come." Jake found himself impressed by the strategic thinking that had gone into Ayana's education. Too many white settlers dismissed the Apache as primitive savages, but the reality was far more complex. These were people who had adapted and evolved their tactics over decades of warfare, learning to use their enemy's own strengths against them. "Is that how you learned to spy on army meetings?" he asked. Ayana's laugh was soft, but carried an edge of danger. "That and other skills that might surprise you. Naiche believes that to defeat an enemy, you must first understand him completely. I have spent years learning to move through the white world like a ghost, gathering information that has saved countless Apache lives." The trail they were following began to climb into the mountains, winding through forests of pine and oak that provided welcome relief from the desert heat. Jake found himself thinking about the irony of his situation. Here he was, riding through some of the most beautiful country he had ever seen, in the company of a remarkable woman, on a mission that might actually accomplish some good in the world. Yet every mile they traveled took him further from the life he had known and deeper into a future he couldn't predict. "What happens if this doesn't work?" he asked. "What if your uncle doesn't trust me? or if the information I provide isn't enough to make a difference." Ayana reined in her horse and turned to look at him, her dark eyes serious. "Then we will have tried, and that is more than most people can say. But I believe it will work, Jake Morrison. I believe it because I have seen the guilt in your eyes, and I know that a man who carries such guilt will fight harder for redemption than most men will fight for gold." Her words carried a weight of conviction that Jake found both comforting and intimidating. He realized that she had been studying him just as carefully as he had been studying her, reading his character and motivations with the same skill she used to gather intelligence about army movements. As they continued their journey into the heart of Apache territory, Jake found himself thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been just another hired gun, working for whoever paid the best and asking few questions about the morality of his actions. Now he was riding toward what might be his death or his salvation, guided by a woman who represented everything he had been taught to fear and hate. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and with it came the heat that would make the afternoon hours almost unbearable. But Jake barely noticed the temperature. His attention focused on the woman riding beside him and the uncertain future that lay ahead. He had made his choice, crossed his Rubicon, and now there was nothing to do but see where the current would carry him. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the canyon walls, its cry echoing off the ancient stone like a war song. Jake took it as a good omen, though he couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was simply the hope that, in a land where death came so easily, life still found a way to soar above the violence and claim its place in the sky. The Apache camp materialized out of the landscape like a mirage, so perfectly integrated with its surroundings that Jake didn't see it until they were almost upon it. Hidden in a box canyon, whose walls rose like cathedral spires toward the azure sky, the collection of wickiups and lean-tos seemed to grow organically from the red earth itself. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily upward, carrying the sense of roasting meat and burning cedar, while children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls, a sound so normal and innocent that it seemed almost surreal in this place of perpetual warfare. As they approached the camp's perimeter, Jake felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, though he could see only a few of the watchers. Apache sentries, he knew, were legendary for their ability to remain invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. And he had no doubt that his every movement was being observed and evaluated by warriors who could kill him before he even knew they were there. Ayana raised her hand in a gesture that Jake assumed was some form of recognition signal, and gradually figures began to emerge from concealment. Men, women, and children appeared as if materializing from the very rocks themselves, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and wariness as they took in the sight of a white man riding peacefully into their sanctuary. "Stay close to me," Ayana murmured, her voice barely audible above the sound of their horses' hooves on the rocky ground. "And whatever happens, do not reach for your weapon. These people have buried too many loved ones to take chances with strangers." Jake nodded, keeping his hands visible and his posture as non-threatening as possible. He could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke from a grass fire, and he knew that one wrong move could turn this peaceful scene into a bloodbath in seconds. An elderly woman approached them, her weathered face marked by the kind of dignity that comes from surviving decades of hardship without losing one's humanity. She spoke to Ayanna in rapid Apache, her tone questioning but not hostile, and Jake caught the musical cadence of a language that seemed to flow like water over stone. Ayanna responded in the same tongue, her voice respectful but confident, and Jake heard his own name mentioned several times during the exchange. The old woman's eyes fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to peer straight through to his soul, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was reading his entire life story in the lines of his face. Finally, the woman nodded and gestured toward the center of the camp, where a large wickiup stood apart from the others. Jake understood that this was their destination, the place where his fate would be decided by men who had every reason to hate everything he represented. As they dismounted and began walking through the camp, Jake was struck by the normalcy of the scene around him. Children played with simple toys carved from wood and bone. Women worked at various tasks with the easy efficiency of long practice. And men sat in small groups, talking quietly or working on weapons and tools. This was not the savage war camp he had been conditioned to expect, but a community of people trying to maintain their way of life in the face of overwhelming odds. "Uncle," Ayanna called out as they approached the central wickiup, and a man emerged from the dwelling who commanded Jake's immediate attention. Nike was not a large man in terms of physical stature, but he possessed a presence that seemed to fill the entire canyon. His face was lean and angular, marked by the kind of intelligence that comes from years of strategic thinking under pressure. His eyes, dark and penetrating, fixed on Jake with an intensity that made the cowboy feel as though he were being dissected and analyzed down to his very bones. The Apache leader was dressed simply in buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt, but he wore his authority like a cloak, and Jake could see why this man had been able to hold together a resistance movement in the face of the U.S. Army's relentless pressure. This was someone who had inherited not just his father's position, but his father's wisdom, and Jake felt a mixture of respect and fear as he waited to learn his fate. Ayanna spoke to her uncle in Apache, her words flowing in a steady stream that Jake assumed contained the story of their meeting and his offer of assistance. Naiche listened without interruption, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. Though Jake noticed that the war chief's eyes never left his face during the entire recitation. When Ayanna finished speaking, a silence fell over the group that had gathered to witness this unusual meeting. Jake could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the accumulative suspicion and hatred of a people who had learned through bitter experience that white men's promises were usually worthless and their gifts often came with hidden costs. Finally, Naiche spoke, his English clear and precise, though accented with the musical tones of his native language. "My niece tells me that you wish to help our people, that you carry gold stolen from those who would use it to kill us. She also tells me that you were present when children were murdered in their sleep, that you carry the guilt of their deaths in your heart." Jake felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to meet the war chief's gaze directly. "That's true," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I was there, and I didn't stop it. I've been carrying that shame ever since, and I'm hoping to find some way to make amends." Naiche studied him for a long moment, and Jake had the feeling that the Apache leader was weighing not just his words, but his very soul. "Guilt is a powerful motivator," the war chief said finally, "but it can also be a weakness. A man who acts from guilt alone may betray his new allies as easily as he betrayed his old ones." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, but he recognized the truth in them. Nietzsche was right to be suspicious. Guilt was indeed an unstable foundation for loyalty, and Jake realized that he needed to offer something more substantial than his own remorse. "You're right," he said, surprising himself with his honesty. "Guilt alone isn't enough. But maybe guilt, combined with a desire for justice, is. Maybe a man who has seen the worst of what his people can do has a responsibility to try to prevent more of the same." Nietzsche's expression shifted slightly, and Jake thought he detected a flicker of approval in the war chief's eyes. "Justice," the Apache leader repeated, as if testing the word. "An interesting concept from a white man. Your people speak often of justice, but they seem to mean something very different by it than we do. Maybe that's because we've forgotten what real justice looks like," Jake replied. "Maybe we've gotten so caught up in taking what we want that we've lost sight of what's right." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several Apache warriors, men whose faces bore the scars and paint of recent combat. They spoke urgently to Nietzsche in their own language, and Jake saw the war chief's expression darken as he listened to their report. "What is it?" Ayana asked, switching to English so that Jake could understand. "Soldiers," Nietzsche replied grimly. "A full company, moving this way from Fort Apache. They will be here by tomorrow evening if they maintain their current pace." Jake felt his blood run cold as he realized the implications. A full company meant at least 100 men, far more than the Apache camp could hope to fight off, especially with women and children to protect. This was exactly the kind of situation where his knowledge of army tactics could prove invaluable. "How many warriors do you have here?" he asked, his mind already racing through possible defensive strategies. Nietzsche looked at him sharply, clearly surprised by the question. "Why do you ask?" "Because if they're coming in force, you'll need to either fight or run. And either way, you'll need to know your options," Jake replied. "I've served with the army, and I know how they think, how they operate. Maybe I can help you figure out the best way to handle this." For the first time since their meeting began, Nietzsche smiled, and Jake was struck by how the expression transformed the war chief's stern features. "Perhaps my niece was right about you, Jake Morrison. Perhaps you are indeed a man who might choose justice over convenience." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western rim of the canyon, Jake found himself in the surreal position of planning defensive strategies with the very people he had once been paid to fight. The irony was not lost on him, but he pushed such thoughts aside, focusing instead on the immediate problem of keeping these people alive through the next 24 hours. The gold in his saddlebag suddenly seemed less important than the knowledge in his head. And Jake realized that Ayana had been right. His real value to the Apache cause lay not in what he could give them, but in what he could teach them about their enemies. As he began to share his insights into army tactics and procedures, he felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced since before the massacre that had changed his life. For the first time in months, Jake Morrison felt like he was fighting for something that mattered, and the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. The soldiers were coming, and when they arrived, they would find an enemy far better prepared than they had any right to expect. And if Jake had anything to say about it, they would also find that their own tactics had been turned against them by someone who knew them all too well. The night that followed was one of intense preparation and quiet desperation, as the Apache camp transformed itself from a peaceful community into a fortress ready for siege. Jake found himself at the center of the planning, his knowledge of army procedures proving invaluable as Nate and his war council developed their strategy for the coming confrontation. "They'll approach from the east," Jake explained, sketching rough diagrams in the dirt with a stick. "That's the most obvious route, and army commanders tend to favor obvious approaches because they're easier to coordinate. They'll probably send scouts ahead to assess your defenses, then pull back to plan their attack." Nate nodded thoughtfully, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering light of the council fire. "And what will they expect to find?" "A typical Apache camp," Jake replied. "Scattered wiki-ups, maybe some defensive positions among the rocks, but nothing too sophisticated. They'll be counting on superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm you." "Then we must give them something they do not expect," Nate said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had survived dozens of such encounters. "Something that will turn their own strengths against them." As the night wore on, Jake found himself increasingly impressed by the tactical sophistication of the Apache War Council. These were not the primitive savages that army propaganda portrayed, but experienced military strategists who had been fighting a guerrilla war against overwhelming odds for decades. Their knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic. Their understanding of their enemy's psychology was acute, and their ability to adapt and improvise was remarkable. Ayana sat beside her uncle throughout the planning session, occasionally offering insights of her own that demonstrated her deep understanding of both Apache and white military thinking. Jake realized that she was far more than just a spy. She was a strategic thinker in her own right, someone who had synthesized the best of both cultures' approaches to warfare. "The canyon has 3 possible escape routes," she explained, pointing to various features of the surrounding landscape. "If the soldiers manage to breach our defenses, we can evacuate the women and children through the hidden passages while the warriors provide covering fire." Jake studied the terrain she was describing, noting how the Apache had chosen their campsite with multiple contingencies in mind. Every aspect of their position had been carefully considered, from the availability of water to the positioning of natural defensive barriers. This was not a people who had survived by accident, but by careful planning and superior knowledge of their environment. As dawn approached, the final preparations were completed. Hidden firing positions had been established among the rocks, escape routes had been cleared and marked, and the camp's most vulnerable members had been moved to secure locations deeper in the canyon. Jake had contributed what he could to the defensive preparations, but he knew that his most important role was yet to come. "When the soldiers arrive, I need to be visible," he told Nate as the war chief made his final rounds of the defensive positions. "If they see me here, fighting alongside your people, it might confuse them enough to give you an advantage." Nate considered this proposal carefully. "It would also mark you as a traitor to your own people. There would be no going back after that." Jake felt the weight of the decision settling over him like a heavy blanket. Once he fired a shot at U.S. soldiers, he would be crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. He would become a wanted man, hunted by the very people he had once served alongside. "I crossed that line the moment I decided to help you," he said quietly. "Everything since then has just been details." The war chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but remember, once you take up arms against the Blue Coats, you become one of us, and we do not abandon our own." As the sun crested the eastern rim of the canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Jake took his position among the Apache defenders and waited for the soldiers to arrive. He had chosen his side, made his commitment, and now there was nothing left to do but see it through to whatever end awaited them all. In the distance, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing larger with each passing minute. The soldiers were coming, just as the scouts had predicted, and with them came the moment of truth that would determine whether Jake Morrison's quest for redemption would end in triumph or tragedy. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls like distant thunder, growing louder with each passing moment as the cavalry column drew closer to the hidden Apache stronghold. Jake crouched behind a boulder near the canyon's entrance, his rifle ready and his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Beside him, Apache warriors waited with the patient stillness of predators, their faces painted for war and their weapons gleaming in the morning sunlight. Captain William Hayes led the cavalry column with the confident bearing of a man who had never encountered an enemy he couldn't defeat through superior firepower and discipline. His blue uniform was immaculate despite the long ride through the desert, and his saber rattled against his saddle with each step of his horse. Behind him rode 97 soldiers, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were entering hostile territory where death could come from any shadow or crevice. "Sergeant Miller," Hayes called to his second-in-command, "deploy the men in standard formation. I want skirmishers on the flanks and the main body ready to advance on my signal." Jake watched the familiar military choreography unfold below him, remembering countless similar operations he had participated in during his time with the Army. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their training evident in every gesture and maneuver. But Jake could also see the weaknesses in their approach, the predictable patterns, the reliance on conventional tactics, the assumption that their enemies would fight according to European rules of warfare. "They're doing exactly what you said they would," Ayanna whispered from her position a few yards away, her voice barely audible above the sound of the wind through the rocks. Jake nodded, watching as the cavalry deployed into attack formation. Hayes is a good soldier, but he's fighting the last war. He's expecting to face Apache warriors using traditional tactics, not a coordinated defense planned by someone who knows his playbook. The captain raised his hand, preparing to signal the advance, when suddenly his horse shied violently, nearly throwing him from the saddle. A moment later, the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, and one of the soldiers in the front rank toppled from his mount, clutching his shoulder. "Ambush!" Hayes shouted, drawing his saber and trying to control his panicked horse. "Return fire! Return fire!" The canyon erupted in chaos as Apache warriors opened fire from concealed positions throughout the rocky terrain. The soldiers, caught in the open and unable to see their attackers, began firing wildly at shadows and muzzle flashes, their disciplined formation dissolving into confusion as horses reared and men sought whatever cover they could find. Jake sighted down his rifle barrel at a sergeant who was trying to rally a group of soldiers near the canyon entrance. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him like a physical force. Then he thought of the children who had died in the Apache camp, of the families destroyed by the endless cycle of violence, and he squeezed the trigger. The sergeant spun and fell, and Jake felt something die inside him even as he worked the bolt of his rifle to chamber another round. He was no longer Jake Morrison, former cavalry scout and railroad guard. He was something new, something that had no name in either the white world or the Apache world, a bridge between two peoples, built from guilt and hope and the desperate desire for redemption. "Morrison!" Captain Hayes's voice cut through the din of battle like a blade. "Jake Morrison! I know you're up there, you traitorous bastard!" Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Hayes had recognized him, probably from the distinctive way he handled his rifle or some other telltale sign. His presence among the Apache defenders was no longer a secret, and that changed everything. "Come down here and face me like a man," Hayes continued, his voice cracking with rage and betrayal. "Come down here and explain why you're fighting alongside the savages who murdered innocent women and children." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow, not because it was untrue, but because it was so painfully accurate. He was fighting alongside people who had indeed killed innocent civilians, just as he had once fought alongside people who had done the same thing. The moral complexity of his situation threatened to overwhelm him, but Ayana's voice cut through his confusion. "Do not listen to him," she said urgently. "He seeks to divide your mind against itself, to make you doubt the rightness of your choice. Remember why you are here." Jake forced himself to focus on the battle raging around him, pushing aside the philosophical questions that threatened to paralyze him. There would be time for moral reflection later, if he survived. Right now, his job was to help these people defend their home against an enemy that would show them no mercy. The Apache tactics were proving devastatingly effective. Instead of meeting the cavalry charge head-on, they had allowed the soldiers to enter the canyon and then attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The soldiers, trained to fight in open terrain, where their superior numbers and firepower could be brought to bear, found themselves trapped in a maze of rocks and shadows where every advantage belonged to their enemies. "Fall back," Hayes shouted, finally recognizing that his position was untenable. "Organized withdrawal. Cover the wounded." But the Apache had anticipated this move as well. As the soldiers began their retreat, they found their escape route blocked by warriors who had circled around behind them during the initial confusion. What had begun as an ambush was rapidly becoming a massacre, and Jake could see the panic beginning to spread through the cavalry ranks. "We need to let some of them escape," he called to Nietzsche, who was directing the battle from a position near the canyon's center. "If we wipe them out completely, they'll send the entire territorial army after you." The war chief nodded grimly, understanding the strategic implications. "Signal the warriors to open a path to the east," he called to one of his lieutenants. "Let the blue coats run, but make sure they remember the cost of entering our lands uninvited." As the Apache warriors began to pull back from certain positions, creating a corridor through which the surviving soldiers could retreat, Jake found himself face to face with Captain Hayes, who had been separated from his men during the chaotic fighting. The two men stared at each other across 20 yards of rocky ground, their weapons trained on each other's hearts. Hayes's face was a mask of rage and betrayal, while Jake felt only a profound sadness for what they had both become. "Why?" Hayes asked, his voice barely audible above the continuing gunfire. "Why did you betray everything you once stood for?" Jake considered the question, searching for words that could explain the journey that had brought him to this moment. "Because I finally figured out what I was really standing for," he said quietly, "and I didn't like what I saw." Hayes's finger tightened on his trigger, and for a moment, Jake thought the captain was going to shoot him down where he stood. Then a bullet from an Apache rifle struck the rock beside Hayes's head, sending chips of stone flying, and the captain's attention was diverted long enough for Jake to take cover behind a boulder. When he looked again, Hayes was gone, retreating with the remnants of his command toward the canyon entrance. The battle was over, and the Apache had won a decisive victory. But Jake knew that this was only the beginning. Word of his presence among the Apache defenders would spread quickly, and soon every law enforcement agency in the territory would be hunting for the white man who had turned traitor to his own race. As the dust settled and the Apache warriors began to tend to their wounded and count their dead, Jake found himself standing beside Ayanna, both of them looking out at the retreating cavalry column. "You'll regret it," she said softly, echoing the words she had spoken when they first met. Jake thought about her prediction, weighing it against the satisfaction he felt at having finally taken a stand for something he believed in. "Maybe," he replied, "but I'll regret doing nothing even more." The sun was setting behind the western rim of the canyon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to mirror the blood that had been spilled on the rocky ground below. Jake Morrison had chosen his side, fired his shots, and crossed the line that separated his old life from whatever lay ahead. There was no going back now, only forward into an uncertain future where redemption might still be possible, if he was brave enough to keep fighting for it. As the Apache camp began the process of treating the wounded and preparing for the inevitable retaliation that would follow their victory, Jake realized that his real journey was just beginning. He had proven his commitment to Ayanna's people through blood and gunfire, but the harder task lay ahead, learning to live with the consequences of his choices and finding a way to build something positive from the ashes of his former life. The desert wind picked up as darkness fell, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice seeming to celebrate the survival of those who belonged to this harsh and beautiful land. Jake Morrison had found his place among them, and for the first time in months, he felt something that might, in time, become peace.